Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, the pollsters who can directly look you in the eyes and tell you we are not liars. We are not paid by anybody to shape narratives in this country. And in fact, if we are not accurate, our business ceases to exist. And that's why I think you should follow us and subscribe and listen to what we have to say about the 2024 election. And that is this: Trump is still winning comfortably in the national race, although maybe slightly less far ahead than he was just a month and a half ago. And that's what we're going to be covering today, an in-depth look at the crosstabs of our latest weekly 2024 election matchup numbers. But before we do, if you think all of the sudden that this race is running away from Trump, then you're probably the victim of an info op, one that unfortunately seems to have been very successful on many people. So let's talk a little bit more about that. This is the Real Clear Politics polling aggregate, and you should trust these people because they try and maintain standards in the polls that they put into the aggregate. And as you can see, like our polling showed, Trump was beating Biden pretty much at every point in time, going all the way back to October 2023. Now, I will say the accuracy of polls is a little bit looser this far out, October, November, December, January, from an election. And our polls did show, in most cases, Trump winning from 5 to 10 points. What I will say is that many mainstream polling organizations had a similar Trump lead as we did. So a lot of this time, Joe Biden had a really bad January. A lot of this time, Trump was winning. But if you see here around sort of the March time period, this is where there was a pretty big media push to paint Joe Biden as a success after his State of the Union speech. But you can see that was also pretty unsuccessful. There's probably a bunch of reasons why, not least of which is issues with his health and mental capacity. But he kind of stuck to this Trump +1 to 1.5 range until all of a sudden the debate happened. And it's almost like the entire polling industry turned on Joe Biden at once. But what I really want to show you is by going to the 3-month scale, this period here, Donald Trump was beating Joe Biden by 3 to 3.5 points. On July 15th, we put out a large 2,500 result likely voter national poll that had Trump +3, the exact same number as the aggregate. And that's because other pollsters, other corporate pollsters in the aggregate also showed that Trump was winning. Now, think back to all of the polling we've put out in the last couple of years. In not one single poll has Kamala Harris been more likable than Joe Biden, done better in a matchup than Joe Biden, or even was perceived to be more competent than Joe Biden. So in our opinion, if you switch the candidates, I would expect to see something like a Trump +3 or 4 lead. And what I have to tell you today is that Trump is winning the race right now by 3 to 4 points, and we're going to get into that. But what is happening now, if we go to the Trump plus Harris numbers, is that the aggregate has swung 4 points left. There is a sea of blue here where there was not one in the Trump versus Biden races. And that makes absolutely no sense to us because, again, Kamala Harris is a worse candidate than Joe Biden. Joe Biden sailed to a presidency based on a massive history of public service and perceived competence. So why did this happen? Well, I can tell you our numbers here are still holding up the aggregate. There's a few other pollsters showing Trump winning. But in my opinion, the real issue is this. All of a sudden, a week after Kamala Harris got anointed, the polling industry got super uninterested in figuring out the state of the race. Everybody tripped all over themselves to poll between July 21st, when she was selected, and August 4th. There were a ton of polls and about as many polls as there were through most of June and July. We're talking about, 8 to 13, 14 polls. Now, all of a sudden, and I will say that this chart was produced on the 14th. There have been another poll or two. But basically, in the last 2 weeks here, a week and a half, there's been like 3 or 4 non-Rasmussen reports, national general election polls. It's almost like the entire industry went right into the field as soon as Kamala Harris was getting her bounce, liked the results they got, and then said, I think we're done here. And that's been pretty effective because what it's allowed them to do is flip the betting market because it's trading on old information. It's also allowed them to be very selective about what gets put into the national news media cycle. You can look at what happened last Sunday with the carefully selected 3 states that New York Times Siena put out that everybody was freaking out about. But at the end of the day, there have not really been that many polls put out. And in fact, in the last couple polls that put out, we've put polls out showing Trump up. Fox News has put polls out showing Trump up. It's really not a clear Kamala Harris is leading narrative as the mainstream media would have you believe. And in our opinion, that's election interference. It extends to some extent to state polling as well. I took the time to count all of the state polls that were released on Real Clear Politics. And in the first 13 days of August, I picked 13 because their history only went back 13 days into July. In the first 13 days of August, there were only 28 state polls released. But in the last 13 days of July, there were 73 state polls released. And that's a really fascinating context when you see things like the fact that 2 pollsters just totally randomly decided to release results from Florida. And I will say that they looked like pretty low energy polls that showed that Donald Trump was winning by only 3 to 5 points. To me, that looks like a crazy coincidence. In an environment where very few state polls are being put out, why did people randomly decide to go into Florida all of a sudden? And it's not like there's been a news hook that Trump is hurting in Florida. And here's the deal. The last time we went into the swing states, I showed Trump up 5 in Georgia. There is no scenario where Trump is up 5 in Georgia, and he's only up 3 to 5 in Florida. Here's another thing to look at. Let's go back to the aggregate here. If Harris is really leading by 1 point, which she is not, compare that to where Joe Biden was doing 4 years ago. Joe Biden was up 8. So that means Harris is doing 7 points worse nationally in all of the polls. In what scenario did Florida elect Donald Trump with like 4 to 5 points 4 years ago and then go on to elect Ron DeSantis in like an upper double digits margin? And now with Harris doing 7 points worse nationally, she's somehow competitive in Florida. That 7 points represents millions and millions of people across the country changing their mind from Democrat to Republican. Where are those people if they're not in Florida? They're definitely in Florida, as all of the increased Republican voter registration headlines would have you believe. Now, before we get into the crosstabs, here is a quick look at our overnight data results updated for last night's responses. And as you can see, Donald Trump has settled into a 3 to 4 point lead. Kamala Harris had a bounce. It's faded a little bit, but what is more accurate to say is that Donald Trump's numbers got a little bit shook and he has reverted back to the mean of where he was before. And let me tell you, this is a lot of polling results, and we are the only polling organization that's actually going to show you how the sausage is made. You are not going to get all the nightly data results from New York Times, Siena, from Pew, from Cook, who is out there releasing polls that have data that's 2 weeks old. Seriously, what is going on there? That is pretty questionable. But here are the crosstabs. Almost 1,900 U.S. likely voters conducted starting last Thursday and going all the way up and until Wednesday night. Here's the two-way matchup. Donald Trump is beating Kamala Harris 49 to 45. And if you look at the rounding, it's actually almost exactly 4 points. Trump is actually winning among women and doing a little bit worse among men in the sample, but it goes back and forth. He's winning among Kamala. He's winning over Kamala Harris by 6 points among men. He's up 2 points among women. Slightly down among 18 to 39-year-olds, which is about where he's been, doing very well amongst middle-aged voters, again, normal. And Kamala Harris is most competitive among older voters. Donald Trump is winning pretty big among white voters, 12 points. Now, these black numbers have really sort of lasered in on about a 25 to 30% range. And, we are not tuning specifically to get what we think is an accurate black voter result. So maybe we'll be a little off from this, but if Donald Trump gets anything north of 20, that's really bad for Democrats. Kamala Harris is only getting 2/3 of the black vote. Donald Trump's doing a little bit tighter with Hispanic voters in this sample, but he's still up by 2. But here are the party numbers. And Donald Trump, again, has a crossover advantage over Kamala Harris, although it's not as big as it has been. This is a 73-point lead among Republicans, but Kamala Harris has, 68-point lead among Democrats. I will say one of the main ways that we appear to differ from some of the other recent polls is that we do not show the surge in enthusiasm, at least recently in the last week or so, that other pollsters have seen. And we got to a point where Trump and Harris were at parity within their party, but Harris has faded somewhat. Donald Trump is winning independent voters by 9 points. And this is another place where we vary quite a bit from some of the recent Harris leading polls. I think Emerson had Kamala Harris beating Trump among independents. I will say in 2020, Joe Biden won independents by a lower double-digit margin, but also in our polling, Joe Biden won independents by a lower double-digit. I mean, we're pretty spot on with independents. We have not changed our methodology. That's one of the reasons that us telling you we are not liars is important. People are doing underhanded tricks with their weighting, with their sample methodology to get a shift that they want in the polling. All of them? Probably not, but some of them, and some of them get cherry-picked by the mainstream media. I have not shifted weightings between Biden and Harris. We have only slightly shifted weightings since the 2020 election. We have not changed our methodology in any particularly major way. So in our polling, independents have completely changed their mind in the last 4 years. Here are the multi-way numbers. And Donald Trump is still winning by 4 points, but it's actually closer to 3.5. I think it was just over it. So it's right in the middle of a 3 to 4 point lead that Donald Trump has. Kennedy's back up to 4 from 3. But it's still a really bad performance for him. And like we've said, none of these third-party candidates are really compelling for anybody. And it doesn't look like the multi-way matchup is really changing the results that much. It's moderated middle-aged voters a little bit. White voters are about the same. Black voters are a little bit less for Trump. Hispanic voters are now more for Trump than they were in the previous question. The crossover situation is about the same, and independents are now winning by 9 points. They're still winning by 9 points. RFK is down to 5 points among independents, only 7 points among 18 to 39-year-olds, 6 points among Hispanics. These numbers are all really bad for him. And a lot of people ask over and over, who does Kennedy hurt more? It's hard to say who he hurts more just by being in the race. But people who say they would vote for Kennedy in the multi-way matchup, in the previous question, 37% of those people voted for Donald Trump and only 20% voted for Kamala Harris. So basically, it's like a 1.5 points that he takes from Trump and a point from Kamala Harris. Not a huge impact either way. And if you've been paying attention to the news, there was a report that came out that he actually went to the Democrats for a cabinet position, which I could have told you, and I probably did tell you in a previous video, makes absolutely no sense because his life's work with vaccine skepticism and government accountability message does not at all fit with the modern mainstream Democrat machine. Really not sure what the next couple of months is going to be like. I'm confident in what we're putting out, and I'll always be tweaking it to try and make it more accurate. We've been thinking about going to a D+3 weighting. Yeah, maybe I'll test it and see what happens. But it looks like for now, look, we've had a switcheroo presidential assassination attempt, interesting new vice presidential picks, and really it hasn't changed the race practically at all in our numbers. The fact that it's changed everybody else's numbers should be perceived as very suspect. And if you want to check it out on our Twitter feed right now at Rasmussen_poll, we just got a really great clip I did retweeted by Cat Turd, which says in not so many words as this video, the exact same thing. The mainstream corporate media has been caught red-handed time and time again, shilling for the establishment. Why should their pollsters, by extension, be any different? If you have any thoughts on this topic, make sure you leave them in the comments at YouTube. I'll try and get to them, but our YouTube channel has been blowing up recently, and I really just can't keep up with it. But if you have any specific question ideas or you see some other ideas that people post that you think are great, make sure you also like those comments so they float to the top and there's a better chance I'll see them. Subscribe while you're there, like the video, follow us at Twitter at Rasmussen_poll, and thanks for watching.